There are three types of diminished chords that I use all the time, and they're great for a lot of things and sound beautiful in chord progressions. Two of them are all over the jazz standards and really just a part of tonal harmony. The last one is something that I learned from Barry Harris, and even if it's not really a part of his 6 diminished system, and actually maybe it's not even really a diminished chord, then it sounds great and I play it all the time, so I'm also going to talk about that. The first one that you want to know is the easy diminished chord, the one that's easy to hear and easy to explain, the dominant diminished chord. Now, a funny side note is that I always get comments from people insisting that all diminished chords are dominant, which, as you'll see, I don't really agree with, but you should think about it in any way that works for you. The dominant diminished chord is really from the minor key, but we can use it in major as well. If you look at the diatonic chords in C harmonic minor, then you have C minor major, D half diminished, E flat major 7 sharp 5, F minor 7, G7, A flat major 7, B diminished, and C minor major 7. And you can also see that it is in fact the arpeggio from the third of G7 flat 9, G, B, D, F, A flat. So the connection to G7 is pretty clear, and it resolves like this. But of course you can also resolve it in major as well. There are two chord progressions with this chord that you see fairly often, and both sound great. One of them is used as a sort of plot twist in the harmony, which is a very nice detail. What is a little bit less obvious is that most of the time the dominant diminished chord is actually used for secondary dominance, like this, where it's a really great transition to the 2 chord. So here it's working as an A7, the dominant of D minor 7, and creates a nice chromatic bass line moving up to D minor 7. Bassline melody is really what diminished chords are all about. A great way to use the dominant diminished is to pretend that it's just a boring old 2/5 and then it suddenly goes somewhere else. I need to talk about the extension on the diminished chord here, but first just check out that this is just a 2/5 in C major that suddenly takes a detour and resolves to A minor 7. On the diminished chord, I'm using a flat 6 as an extension, and this is an important note to know for the diminished chord. In both examples, the diminished chord is a secondary dominant, and they simply just take the scale that you would use for the dominant. So if it resolves to A minor 7, then you would use a harmonic minor over that diminished chord, because it kind of works as an E7 to A minor. And from that scale, the E is a great sounding extension and also the root of the dominant that is associated with the diminished chord, E7. The reason why I say that is important is mainly that the flat 6 is very common as a melody note on a diminished chord, as you can see here on Someday My Prince Will Come and in All the Things You Are. But both of these diminished chords are subdominant diminished, which are actually the most common ones. So let's look at how that works. Where the dominant diminished is easy to understand because it's a diatonic chord in harmonic minor and closely related to the 5 chord, then you have these chords that move in a very different way. One of them is moving down. And this one moves up but doesn't really resolve like a dominant. Let's start with the F6 to F sharp diminished example. I'll first go over the chords and then get into scale choices. Here you can see how the F sharp diminished appears from altering 2 notes in the F6. You can also see that it still contains a C and not a B, which is why it isn't dominant in the key of C major. It doesn't sound anything like a G7. The oversimplified way of arriving at that this is a subdominant chord is just to ask 2 things. 1, does it move to C major 7 as if it's resolving? And in this case it does, so it isn't tonic. 2, does it sound and resolve like a G7? Which it doesn't, so that means that it isn't dominant. And if it isn't tonic and also not dominant, then it's subdominant. And this is of course a bit crude, but it kind of does fit in this case. Since it's subdominant, then it makes sense to notate it as derived from the 4 chord. So I usually write them as sharp 4 diminished chords. And there are actually other sharp 4 subdominant chords, but that's probably for another video. I find it very useful to think in groups of subdominant chords. So sometimes I just write sharp 4 dim instead of subdominant diminished, because that's a very long word, and I'm from Denmark, which is a very small country, so we don't really have room for that stuff. And in fact, I'll just write 4 when I mean subdominant. So a backdoor dominant, which is also a minor subdominant, is referred to as a 4 minor chord. I usually make it clear in the videos, but sometimes it slips, and I really find it useful to have these different categories of subdominants. So a sharp 4, a 4, and a 4 minor. Before the last type of diminished chord, then there is also the other variation of the subdominant diminished. This is really just an inversion of the sharp 4 diminished, E flat diminished, so it essentially has the 7th in the bass, and the subdominant diminished here is resolving to another subdominant chord, the D minor 7. And in a way, this is similar to how we have other sort of subdominant chord progressions like 4, 4 minor, back to 1. And this sounds great to have a chord that can help you transition to a 2 chord, which is of course also how it is used most of the time. With the dominant diminished, then you have a scale that it's found in, and it's a part of how we think about it, which makes it a lot easier. The subdominant diminished is a little bit more vague, but if you look at it from a different perspective, then you can easily construct a scale that fits the context of the key, and then you realize that you probably already know that scale. And it's not the diminished scale, but I'll return to that in a bit. If you look at the notes of F sharp diminished and the notes of the C major scale, then there are 2 ways to create a scale that works. You, of course, need to make the F into an F sharp, and then you can choose to make the D a D sharp, and in that way fit the chord in there that gives you E harmonic minor, or you can choose to make the E an E flat, and then you have G harmonic major. They both work and are actually only 1 note different, so it's really up to you. I tend to recommend using the harmonic minor scale, mostly because you need that anyway and you probably already know it. So why are you not using the diminished scale? It's called the diminished chord. In the end, you can use any scale that you want to. It's more about what you do with the notes and what scale it is. And the chord progressions that I'm talking about in this video are all tonal, so they're in a key, and that tells you something about how they sound and which notes wants to go where. And you don't hear each chord as an isolated thing. You hear the whole progression work together, or the whole song. And the diminished scale is atonal because it's symmetrical, it can resolve to a lot of places, and nothing sounds like the root. That's why it doesn't really fit and is more of a special effect in the music. As I already hinted at, then the final diminished chord is maybe not really a chord. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn something important from it. When I was at the piano class with Barry Harris, that first year I went to The Hague, then he told all the piano players to play this exercise that I then transferred to guitar. And it's actually something that's all over my comping and chord solos. This exercise is taking drop 2 voicings for major 7th with a 9 chords, and then move the 7th and the 9th down to the major 6 and the root in half steps. And as you can probably see, then every time in the middle, the chord is a B flat diminished chord. But maybe this is a place where looking at what is happening vertically and giving it a name as a chord is actually not the best way to understand it. Instead, it makes a lot more sense to think of it as voices moving, because the diminished chord only appears as a side effect of some chromatic voice leading. Probably that's also why it's not something you're going to find notated as a chord in a song. At least I can't think of one that has this. That of course doesn't mean that this isn't a great sound. And actually this exercise sounds great in minor as well, where it doesn't give you that dim chord. And how you think about things and understand what is going on in the song can make a huge difference in how easy it is to learn and internalize it, so that it becomes something that you can hear, something you can use in your playing. Some of the most valuable lessons for me were about how to approach things and what to focus on. And I discuss 5 of the most powerful strategies in this video.